Christmas Eve in Manhattan. Snow drifted slowly past the glowing windows of one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, while laughter echoed across tables filled with families, champagne glasses, and children tearing open tiny presents beneath golden lights. Every table in the restaurant was full except one. Near the far corner beside the frosted window sat 76-year-old Richard Whitmore, a billionaire who had spent 4 decades building one of the largest real estate empires in America. His tailored black coat hung neatly over the chair beside him, his silver watch reflected the candlelight, and 6 untouched plates rested silently across the massive table he had reserved weeks earlier for his family. The waiters already knew the truth before the night had even begun. Nobody was coming. Not his son, not his daughter-in-law, not his grandchildren, not even the assistants he paid generously throughout the year had answered his messages. One by one, every phone call had gone to voicemail, and as Richard stared at the empty chairs surrounding him, something inside the old billionaire finally began to break. Because for the first time in his entire life, the man who could buy almost anything in the world realized there was one thing money could no longer bring back. Then, just before midnight, the restaurant doors slowly opened. Freezing cold air swept through the room, and a tired single mother walked inside holding the hand of a little girl in a faded red coat. What happened over the next few hours would uncover a family secret, buried for more than 30 years, and change all of their lives forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard Whitmore had once been called the king of Manhattan real estate. Back in the 1980s and early 90s, newspapers constantly featured his face beside headlines celebrating billion-dollar developments, luxury towers, and impossible business deals. Men admired him. Competitors feared him. Investors followed him without hesitation. At the height of his success, Richard owned hotels across New York, private properties in Aspen and Miami, and enough wealth to ensure that his grandchildren's grandchildren would never have to work a single day in their lives. But somewhere between the boardrooms, private jets, and endless meetings, Richard slowly became a stranger to the people waiting for him at home. His wife Eleanor used to tell friends that Richard loved his buildings more than his own family, though she always laughed softly after saying it, as if turning the truth into a harmless joke somehow made it hurt less. Their daughter Caroline had once worshipped her father when she was young. She would wait near the front window every Friday night, hoping he would arrive home early enough to read her bedtime stories or help decorate the Christmas tree. Most nights, he never came home before she fell asleep. Richard always promised he would make it up to her someday. Someday became years. Years became decades. And eventually, the distance inside the Whitmore family grew too large for anyone to ignore. By the time Caroline turned 26, she had completely fallen out with her father. Richard had carefully planned her future from the day she was born. He wanted her to marry into another wealthy family, take a leadership role inside the company, and continue expanding the Whitmore empire long after he retired. Caroline wanted something entirely different. She fell in love with a high school history teacher named Daniel Bennett, a man raised in a small Pennsylvania town who owned an old pickup truck, wore thrift store jackets, and cared absolutely nothing about money. Richard hated him immediately. He believed Daniel was beneath their family name and accused him of using Caroline to gain access to wealth. The arguments inside the Whitmore mansion became unbearable. Eleanor often stood helplessly between her husband and daughter as screaming matches echoed through the halls late into the night. On one stormy evening in December nearly 32 years earlier, Richard finally gave Caroline an ultimatum. If she married Daniel, she would lose access to the family fortune forever. Caroline stood silently in the middle of the living room while tears rolled down her face. Then she removed the diamond necklace Richard had once given her for graduation, placed it carefully on the table, and walked out of the mansion without saying another word. That was the last time Richard ever saw his daughter. At first, Richard convinced himself she would eventually return. Weeks passed, then months. Pride hardened inside him like stone. Even after Eleanor begged him countless times to call Caroline and apologize, Richard refused. He buried himself deeper into work instead. Every new skyscraper became another distraction from the silence growing inside his own home. Years later, Eleanor passed away after a long illness, and the mansion that once hosted extravagant Christmas gatherings suddenly felt unbearably empty. Richard still reserved the same restaurant table every Christmas Eve out of habit, hoping one year Caroline might somehow appear again. But she never did. Unknown to Richard, Caroline and Daniel had struggled through years of financial hardship after leaving New York. They moved from apartment to apartment across small towns in Ohio before finally settling in Boston. Caroline gave birth to a daughter named Sarah Bennett, but the stress of constant financial pressure slowly destroyed her marriage. Daniel eventually disappeared from their lives completely, leaving Caroline alone to raise Sarah while working multiple jobs just to survive. Even through all the hardship, Caroline never spoke badly about her father. In fact, she secretly wrote letters to Richard every single Christmas, hoping reconciliation might still be possible someday. But those letters never reached him. Back inside the Manhattan restaurant on that snowy Christmas Eve, Sarah Bennett tightened her grip around her daughter Emma's tiny hand while trying to ignore the uncomfortable stares surrounding them. Sarah's coat was damp from the snow outside, and exhaustion rested heavily beneath her eyes after working a double shift earlier that evening. She had promised Emma they would still have a proper Christmas dinner somehow, even if all they could afford was soup and bread. The hostess looked uncertain the moment Sarah quietly asked if there were any available tables left. Emma stood silently beside her mother, shivering slightly beneath the oversized red coat Caroline had once bought years earlier from a second-hand store. Before the hostess could respond, Richard Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes from the untouched plates across his table and noticed the little girl staring directly at him. Something about Emma's face made his chest tighten instantly. It was not just the child's eyes or expression. It was familiarity, the kind that reaches into someone's memory before they can explain why. Emma gently tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered something too quietly for anyone else to hear. Sarah looked embarrassed and immediately shook her head as if discouraging her daughter from speaking further. But Emma kept staring toward the lonely billionaire sitting alone beside 6 empty chairs. And a few seconds later, the little girl let go of her mother's hand and slowly walked across the restaurant floor toward Richard Whitmore's table. The entire restaurant seemed to quiet down as Emma stopped beside Richard's table and looked up at the old billionaire with the kind of innocent curiosity only children possess. Richard slowly lowered the glass in his hand, unsure why his heartbeat had suddenly become so heavy inside his chest. Up close, the resemblance became even harder to ignore. The little girl's soft brown eyes reminded him painfully of someone he had spent decades trying not to think about every single day. Emma glanced across the 6 untouched dinner plates before looking back at Richard again. "Did your family forget to come too?" she asked softly. The question hit harder than any business failure or financial loss Richard had ever experienced in his entire life. A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances while Sarah hurried toward the table, clearly mortified by the situation. She immediately apologized and reached for Emma's hand, but Richard surprised everyone by gently shaking his head. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice carrying far less authority than it once did. Emma noticed the old silver watch resting near Richard's plate and stared at it for several long seconds. Then she said something that made the color slowly drain from the billionaire's face. "My grandma used to have a picture of that watch." For a moment, Richard could not speak. Sarah froze beside the table, confused by the sudden tension hanging in the air. Richard slowly picked up the silver watch with trembling fingers. It was an antique piece engraved with the initials EW on the back, a gift Eleanor had given him during their first Christmas together nearly 50 years earlier. Caroline used to play with that watch constantly as a child, pretending it was magical because it made a tiny clicking sound whenever Richard opened it. Richard stared at Emma carefully. "What did your grandmother's picture look like?" he finally asked. Emma pointed toward the watch. "It looked exactly like that one. My grandma kept the picture inside a little wooden box with old letters." Sarah's expression suddenly shifted. "Emma," she interrupted quickly, "that's enough." But Richard was already standing now, unable to ignore the feeling building inside him. "What was your grandmother's name?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "Caroline Bennett." The second those words left her mouth, Richard felt the room around him disappear completely. The old billionaire slowly sat back down as memories he had spent decades burying came rushing back all at once. Caroline laughing while decorating Christmas cookies beside a leaner. Caroline crying the night she walked out of the mansion. Caroline standing in the snow outside Whitmore Estates with a suitcase in one hand, while Richard refused to stop her from leaving. Sarah noticed the shock in Richard's face and immediately grew defensive. "Look, I don't know what this is," she said carefully, "but if my mother knew you, it was a very long time ago." Richard could barely process what he was hearing. Sarah Bennett, Caroline's daughter, his granddaughter, sitting only a few feet away from him after more than 30 years of silence. Richard opened his mouth several times before finally asking the one question that terrified him most. "Your mother, where is she now?" Sarah's eyes lowered instantly. "She passed away 6 years ago." The words landed like a knife directly into Richard's chest. For several seconds, he simply stared at the candlelight flickering across the table, while guilt, grief, and regret crashed through him harder than anything he had ever known. All those years he spent believing there would eventually be time to fix things suddenly meant nothing at all. Emma climbed gently into the empty chair beside Richard without understanding the full weight of the moment unfolding around her. "Grandma used to talk about New York during Christmas all the time," she said softly. "She said the snow looked prettier here." Richard swallowed hard as Sarah looked increasingly uncomfortable. She clearly had no idea how deeply connected this old billionaire truly was to her family. Sarah explained that her mother rarely discussed her past in detail. Caroline had always avoided conversations about her wealthy upbringing, especially after Daniel abandoned them. Most of Sarah's childhood memories involved watching her mother work endless shifts at diners, grocery stores, and laundromats just to keep food on the table. "She never hated whoever hurt her," Sarah admitted quietly. "That's the strange part. Even when things got really hard, she still talked about him like she hoped he would come back someday." Richard closed his eyes briefly after hearing those words. For 32 years, he had convinced himself Caroline probably despised him. The possibility that she had actually waited for reconciliation destroyed him even more. A waiter approached awkwardly to ask whether Richard was ready for dessert service, but the billionaire barely acknowledged him. Instead, he slowly looked across the table toward Sarah. "Please," he said quietly, "sit down, both of you." Sarah hesitated before finally taking a seat beside Emma. The restaurant around them slowly returned to normal conversation, though several guests continued glancing curiously toward the corner table, where Manhattan's famous billionaire now sat beside a struggling single mother and her child like they had known each other forever. Richard asked Sarah about her life, her work, and how she ended up in New York on Christmas Eve. Sarah admitted she had recently lost her apartment after falling behind on rent payments following medical bills for Emma earlier that year. She had taken a temporary housekeeping job in Manhattan, hoping to save enough money to start over somewhere else after the holidays. Richard listened silently, while guilt continued tightening inside him with every detail she revealed. Caroline had suffered through years of hardship, while he lived surrounded by unimaginable wealth only a few states away. And now her daughter was enduring the same struggle. As the conversation continued, Emma suddenly reached into her tiny backpack and pulled out a faded photograph folded carefully between several sheets of paper. "This is the picture Grandma kept," she said proudly before handing it to Richard. The billionaire stared at the photo with shaking hands. It was an old Christmas picture taken inside Whitmore Estates more than 35 years earlier. Eleanor stood smiling beside a massive Christmas tree, while young Caroline sat on Richard's shoulders laughing. The silver watch was visible on Richard's wrist. For a brief moment, Richard could barely breathe. On the back of the photograph, written in Caroline's handwriting, were words that nearly shattered what remained of the old man's composure. "No matter how far apart we become, family should always find their way home." Richard lowered his head slowly as tears finally escaped his eyes for the first time in years. Emma looked surprised. "Why are you crying?" she asked innocently. Richard looked at the little girl across from him and answered with painful honesty. "Because I wasted too much time." Sarah sat frozen beside the table, watching the old billionaire struggle to hold himself together, while Emma continued eating bread rolls, completely unaware that her simple questions had just reopened wounds buried for more than 3 decades. Richard carefully wiped his eyes and stared once more at the faded photograph trembling in his hands. For most of his life, people feared him too much to ever see weakness in him. Employees described him as ruthless. Newspapers called him brilliant but emotionally distant. Even his own son often joked that Richard Whitmore cared more about contracts than human beings. Yet now, on Christmas Eve, surrounded by expensive wine and untouched lobster dinners, the billionaire who once dominated Manhattan sat silently crying over an old family photograph handed to him by a little girl wearing a worn-out red coat. Sarah finally leaned forward carefully. "You knew my mother, didn't you?" she asked softly. Richard looked toward her slowly before answering in a voice weighed down by regret. "She was my daughter." Sarah's entire expression changed instantly. For several seconds, she simply stared at him without blinking, almost as if her mind refused to process what she had just heard. The silence between them became unbearably heavy. Emma looked back and forth between the two adults in confusion, while Sarah slowly leaned away from the table. "No," she whispered under her breath. "That's impossible." Richard nodded weakly. "I understand why you feel that way." Sarah's breathing became uneven as years of unanswered questions suddenly collided inside her mind. Her mother had spent her entire life avoiding conversations about the Whitmore family. Whenever Sarah asked about her grandfather, Caroline would grow quiet before changing the subject completely. All Sarah truly knew was that her mother once came from money and that something painful had destroyed the relationship forever. Richard slowly explained everything. He told Sarah about the argument with Caroline decades earlier, about his obsession with reputation and control, about how he believed cutting her off financially would force her to come back home and abandon Daniel. "I thought I was protecting the family," Richard admitted quietly. "But the truth is, I was protecting my own pride." Sarah looked down at the table while emotions battled across her face. Anger, shock, confusion, sadness. She had spent years watching her mother struggle to survive while the man responsible sat surrounded by unimaginable wealth only a few hundred miles away. Emma gently touched Sarah's arm. "Mommy," she whispered nervously. Sarah immediately pulled herself together enough to smile faintly at her daughter before turning back toward Richard again. "Do you have any idea what she went through?" Sarah asked quietly, though pain sharpened every word. "Do you know how many nights she skipped meals so I could eat? Do you know how hard she worked?" Richard lowered his eyes immediately because the truth was he did not know. He had missed all of it. Every birthday, every Christmas, every hardship, every moment that mattered. After Caroline disappeared from his life, Richard buried himself deeper into work instead of facing what he had done. His empire grew larger every year while his family slowly disappeared piece by piece. Aliner's death only worsened the emptiness. Richard remembered sitting alone in his massive mansion after the funeral, staring at rooms filled with expensive furniture that suddenly felt completely meaningless without the people who once filled them with life. Yet even then, pride continued stopping him from searching harder for Caroline. "I kept telling myself there would still be time," he admitted softly. "And then one day there was." Sarah stared at him for several long seconds before finally asking the question she had secretly carried her entire life. "If you loved her so much, why didn't you go find her?" Richard closed his eyes briefly. It was the question he had asked himself countless nights while sitting alone in the darkness of Whitmore Estates. "Because I was a coward," he answered honestly. "Every year that passed made it harder to face what I had done. I thought maybe she hated me. Maybe she never wanted to see me again." Sarah shook her head slowly after hearing that. "She never hated you." Richard looked up immediately. Sarah reached into Emma's backpack and carefully pulled out several old envelopes tied together with a faded ribbon. "My mother kept these hidden for years," she explained quietly. "I found them after she died." Richard stared at the envelopes in disbelief the moment he recognized Caroline's handwriting. His hands trembled violently as Sarah placed the letters in front of him. "She wrote to you every Christmas," Sarah continued, "but she never mailed them." Richard carefully picked up the first envelope as though it might disappear if he touched it too quickly. On the front, written in Caroline's familiar handwriting, were words that instantly broke something deep inside him. "For Dad, in case we ever find our way back to each other." For several moments, Richard simply stared at the letters without opening them. The restaurant around them no longer existed in his mind. Nothing existed except the crushing realization that Caroline had never stopped hopping for reconciliation. Sarah watched quietly as the billionaire finally opened the oldest envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter written nearly 25 years earlier. Richard began reading silently at first, but after a few lines, his composure completely collapsed. Caroline wrote about missing Christmas mornings inside Whitmore Estates. She wrote about Alina teaching her how to bake cinnamon cookies while Richard worked late in his office. She wrote about wishing Sarah could someday meet the grandfather she still remembered loving despite everything that had happened between them. But one sentence shattered Richard more than all the others combined. No matter how angry Dad became, part of me still believes he loved me the only way he knew how. Richard covered his mouth as tears streamed openly down his face. He had spent decades believing Caroline died hatting him, when in reality she had been waiting for him to return all along. Emma slid quietly from her chair and wrapped her tiny arms around Richard's shoulder without saying a word. The old billionaire looked down at the little girl holding on to him so naturally, and suddenly understood how much life he had truly lost chasing success that no longer mattered. Across the restaurant, several guests discreetly wiped tears from their own eyes after noticing the emotional scene unfolding near the window. Sarah watched silently while emotions continued shifting inside her. Part of her wanted to stay angry for her mother's sake, but another part saw something she never expected to witness from a man like Richard Whitmore: genuine remorse. Not the polished apologies wealthy men gave during interviews or scandals. Real regret. The kind that arrives too late to undo the damage already done. Richard slowly looked toward Sarah again. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said quietly. "But if there's anything left I can do now, anything at all, I want to try." Sarah did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked out beyond the frosted restaurant windows, where snow continued falling softly across Manhattan, while Christmas lights reflected against the streets below. Then she finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My mother always believed family could still heal if people were willing to tell the truth." Richard nodded slowly, unable to speak through the emotion tightening his throat. But neither of them realized that before the night ended, another truth would surface, one capable of changing the Whitmore family forever. Richard sat motionless after Sarah's words, staring at the stack of letters spread across the table like pieces of a life he could have lived but abandoned long ago. Outside, the snowfall had grown heavier, covering the Manhattan streets in a quiet layer of white while the restaurant slowly emptied as families returned home to continue their Christmas celebrations. Yet Richard could not remember the last time he had felt more awake. For years his life had moved with mechanical routine. Wake up. Meetings. Investments. Boardrooms. Silence. Repeat. Every Christmas Eve ended exactly the same way. He would reserve a large table pretending hope still existed, sit alone for hours, then return to the enormous mansion that no longer felt like a home. But tonight was different. Tonight, the ghosts of his past were no longer distant memories. They were sitting directly across from him. And for the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore realized he had been given something he never thought possible. Another chance. Emma eventually fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder, while Richard quietly paid the restaurant bill. As they prepared to leave, Sarah admitted she still had nowhere to take Emma for the night because the temporary apartment she had been renting earlier that month was no longer available. Richard stood silently for several seconds before finally speaking. "Please come to Whitmore Estates tonight," he said carefully. Sarah immediately looked uncertain. Richard understood why. To her, he was still practically a stranger connected to years of pain and unanswered questions. "Not out of pity," he added quickly. "And not because I think money fixes any of this. I just don't want my family spending Christmas Eve alone anymore." The word family lingered heavily in the air. Sarah looked down at Emma sleeping peacefully against her chest before finally agreeing. The drive through Manhattan felt strangely quiet. Christmas lights glowed across the city while soft music played through the car speakers, but nobody spoke much. Richard spent most of the ride watching Emma sleep, still unable to believe the little girl beside him was his great-granddaughter. When they arrived at Whitmore Estates, Sarah could not hide her shock. The mansion looked less like a house and more like a luxury hotel hidden behind iron gates and towering snow-covered trees. Yet despite the size and wealth surrounding it, The home felt strangely empty the moment they stepped inside. The giant Christmas tree in the entrance hall remained undecorated except for a few scattered ornaments placed there weeks earlier by the staff. Most of the rooms sat dark and untouched. Richard noticed Sarah observing the silence and gave a faint smile filled with sadness. "A house this big gets very loud when nobody's inside it," he admitted. Emma slowly woke up and stared around in amazement before immediately running toward the enormous tree near the staircase. "You don't have presents under it," she said innocently. Richard looked toward the empty space beneath the tree and quietly answered, "No, I suppose I stopped expecting anyone to open them." Emma thought about that for a moment before removing the tiny knitted snowman from her backpack, one Caroline had made years earlier, and placing it carefully beneath the tree. "Now you do," she whispered. Something about that simple gesture nearly broke Richard all over again. For decades he had measured value through billion-dollar contracts and luxury possessions, yet this tiny handmade ornament suddenly felt more precious than anything he owned. Sarah watched the old billionaire carefully as he crouched beside the tree, staring at the little snowman. She could finally see the loneliness hidden beneath his polished public image. Richard Whitmore was not just a wealthy man. He was a man who had spent years trapped inside the consequences of his own choices. Later that night, after Emma fell asleep in one of the guest rooms, Sarah wandered through the mansion unable to rest. Family portraits lined the hallways like frozen pieces of another lifetime. In nearly every photograph, Richard looked distracted or emotionally distant even during moments that should have been joyful. Then Sarah noticed one picture that stopped her completely. It showed young Caroline sitting beside Richard on Christmas morning while holding a tiny wrapped box. Both of them were laughing. It was the happiest Sarah had ever seen her mother look in any photograph. Richard quietly approached from behind after noticing her standing there. "That was the last Christmas before everything fell apart," he admitted softly. Sarah turned toward him slowly. "My mother kept that same smile even after everything she went through," she said. "I used to wonder how." Richard lowered his eyes. "Caroline got that strength from her mother. Eleanor believed people were worth loving even when they disappointed you." Sarah hesitated before asking the question still lingering in her mind. "Did your son know about us?" Richard's expression immediately changed. A shadow crossed his face before he answered. "William knew Caroline tried reaching out years ago." Sarah frowned slightly. "What do you mean tried?" Richard walked slowly toward his office without speaking, then opened an old drawer near the fireplace. Inside sat several unopened envelopes covered in dust. Sarah's heart sank instantly when she recognized Caroline's handwriting again. Richard looked devastated. "I found these only a few months ago after firing one of my longtime assistants," he explained quietly. "William intercepted the letters years ago and hid them." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Why would he do that?" Richard's jaw tightened painfully. "Because he believed reconnecting with Caroline would threaten his inheritance and position inside the company." The realization hit Sarah like ice water. Caroline had tried to come home, again and again, and someone inside the family had deliberately prevented it. Richard slowly sat beside the fireplace while guilt consumed him completely. "If I had known," he began, but Sarah gently interrupted him. "You can't change what happened." Richard nodded weakly. "No, but I could have searched harder. I could have swallowed my pride years earlier." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly while snow continued falling beyond the windows. Finally, Sarah asked the question Richard feared most. "If my mother were standing here right now, what would you say to her?" The old billionaire stared into the flames before answering in a voice filled with unbearable regret. "I'd tell her she was right to leave. I'd tell her she deserved a better father than the man I became. And I'd tell her I spent every Christmas hoping somehow she would walk back through those doors again." Tears filled Sarah's eyes hearing those words, because deep down she knew her mother would have forgiven him instantly. That was who Caroline Bennett had always been. The next morning sunlight reflected across the snow-covered estate, while the smell of cinnamon and coffee drifted through the mansion for the first time in years. Emma laughed loudly while decorating the giant Christmas tree beside Richard using boxes of old ornaments stored away for decades. Sarah watched quietly from the kitchen doorway, overwhelmed by the strange feeling growing inside her chest. For the first time since her mother's death, Christmas no longer felt painful. Richard moved slower than usual, his aging hands slightly unsteady as he helped Emma place ornaments across the tree, but there was life in his eyes again. Real life, not the hollow emptiness he carried the night before. At one point, Emma held up a small golden ornament shaped like a star and asked Richard where it belonged. The billionaire looked toward the very top of the tree and smiled softly. "That one goes highest," he answered. Emma grinned. "Then you should put it there." Richard carefully lifted the ornament toward the top branch, while Sarah suddenly remembered something her mother once told her as a child. "People can spend their whole lives lost," Caroline had said, "but sometimes love finds them again when they least expect it." Later that afternoon, Richard gathered Sarah and Emma inside the living room where a stack of legal documents rested on the coffee table. Sarah immediately looked uncomfortable, assuming he planned to offer money or expensive gifts. Richard noticed her expression and shook his head gently. "This isn't charity," he explained. "It's accountability." He revealed he had already contacted his attorneys earlier that morning. Whitmore Estates, along with a large portion of his company shares, would eventually pass to Sarah and Emma instead of William. Sarah looked stunned. "Richard, you don't have to do that." The billionaire gave a faint, sad smile. "No amount of money can repay what your mother went through, but I refuse to let greed destroy this family again." Sarah hesitated before finally asking, "What happens when William finds out?" Richard looked toward the Christmas tree where Emma sat humming softly while playing with ornaments. "For the first time in my life," he said quietly, "I honestly don't care." That evening, the mansion finally felt alive again. Music echoed through the halls. The dining table, once surrounded by emptiness, now held laughter, conversation, and warmth. Richard found himself listening more than speaking, memorizing every detail about Sarah and Emma as though trying to recover lost years in a single night. At one point, Emma climbed onto Richard's lap holding an ornament she had made earlier from paper and glitter. Across the front, written in crooked childish handwriting, was one simple word. "Family." Richard stared at it silently while emotion overwhelmed him again. After everything he had lost, after decades of isolation and regret, the lonely billionaire who once believed power mattered more than people finally understood the truth far too many discover too late. Success means very little if there is nobody left to share it with. Months later, reporters across New York noticed a dramatic change in Richard Whitmore. The billionaire who once avoided public appearances began quietly funding shelters for struggling single mothers and housing programs for families facing eviction. Employees inside Whitmore Industries described him as calmer, kinder, more human. But the greatest change happened far from boardrooms or headlines. Every Sunday afternoon, without fail, Richard sat inside the same living room at Whitmore Estates listening to Emma read stories, while Sarah filled the house with laughter Caroline would have loved hearing herself. And though regret never fully disappeared, Richard finally understood something his daughter had known all along. Family is not measured by pride, wealth, or control. It is measured by who stays when life becomes difficult. On that snowy Christmas Eve, a lonely billionaire thought he was waiting for a dinner reservation that would never be filled. What he never expected was that the greatest gift of his entire life would walk through the restaurant doors wearing a faded red coat and holding her mother's hand. And maybe that is the painful truth so many people spend years avoiding. We chase money, status, and success believing there will always be time later for the people we love. Later to apologize. Later to reconnect. Later to come home. But life has a way of moving faster than pride is willing to admit. Richard Whitmore learned that lesson only after losing almost everything that truly mattered. The question is, how many others are still waiting for tomorrow to fix what should have been repaired today? If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what part affected you the most. Do you think Richard deserved a second chance after everything that happened, or do some mistakes stay with us forever? We'd really love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons in life come from the people we least expect. And trust me, the next story we're about to share may change the way you see family forever.